Greetings and welcome to the 17th episode of Morrowind Modding Interviews. With me today is Trainwiz, the author of Sotha Sil Expanded and the Racer Recursion mod, which I'm sure everyone knows by now. And to start off, we're going to ask a few basic questions, and the first of which is, when did you first start playing Morrowind and the Elder Scrolls in general?
I can't remember the exact year I started playing Morrowind. It was my first Elder Scrolls game, and it was my brother who introduced me to it, I think sometime back in maybe 2004 or 2005. And this was my first experience both with an Elder Scrolls game and an open world RPG. And it really was kind of mind-blowing, just the scale of things.
Oh yeah, for the time, Morrowind was a pretty large open world RPG. Not as large as Daggerfall, obviously, but for the 2000s era, it was fairly large. Now, how much of the original Morrowind have you played through over the years, and how long after starting did it take you to get an itch to mod it?
I think there's one or two things in Morrowind that I haven't done, but I have completed all the faction quest lines, all the main quest lines multiple times. And I think it was after the first playthrough of Morrowind, Tribunal, and Blood Moon that I first discovered there were mods and first started modding it. Because the minute I found out there were modding tools, that's when I started to actually make them myself.
Now, that's pretty interesting. I don't think I've ever met anyone who's actually finished all the faction quest lines in Morrowind before. I mean, I certainly haven't. I haven't done any of the vampire clans or Morag Tong or any of that.
I usually like to complete them first before I start modding them, because then I have a greater idea of what I want to change or modify or add.
Well, on a similar note, since you've also done a ton of mods for Skyrim, how much of the original Skyrim have you played through, and how long until you started modding it?
Well, when I first started playing Skyrim, it had literally just came out. I mean, it was only a few years ago. So when it first came out, there were obviously very, very, very few mods in existence. So I did quite a bit of stuff. I think I started to mod it right around the time the creation kits were actually released.
Oh yeah, they had that, what was it, was it a year delay in between the release of the game itself and
I think a little less than a year.
Yeah, I was thinking it didn't come out at the same time as Skyrim, it came out sometime later.
I think it was like sometime in February, so maybe a few months.
Now that sounds about right, and sort of going into another question, what inspired your forum handle?
Well, if you haven't guessed already, I like trains a lot. All my forum handles have had some variation on liking trains. And I think this is the one that I've actually used for the longest. It's just always kind of stuck with me. So it was always the logical choice when I started to pick a forum handle.
I'm just sort of curious, because you're also known, you have the YouTube account like Pasta Space. Is there some sort of train connection to that one?
No, Pasta Space was a joke my brother made up, and it's also the name of my actual company. So Trainwiz was always the guy, and Pasta Space was always more of the group.
Oh, I see. And what was your first mod, and how did you get the idea for it?
My first mod, I really cannot remember. It was something little and tiny and stupid. It was literally just me trying to figure out the construction set and how it worked. But the first published mod I ever made was Deus Ex Machina, and that was about 4 years of work and then some. And it originally just started as I had downloaded not Darknut, but Pirate Lord's Greater Dwemer Ruins, and I used some of his assets to make a train. And from there, you know what, I want to give a storyline to this train. And from there, it kind of blew up into a giant landmass mod. And after a while, it pretty much didn't have anything to do with the train. And that took about 4 years to make, and at that point, I was so burned out, I just released it.
Oh yes, most modders don't release a giant mod like that as their first published mod. It's like usually a house mod or something. Was a lot of that feature creep?
I don't think it was feature creep, at least initially. I actually had to cut down on a lot of features I wanted to do. For example, the island in Deus Ex Machina was a lot lot smaller than it originally was meant to be. There was going to be a lot of different regions, there was going to be a desert and this, big technological wasteland, which kind of came to fruition later on in the later patches. But for the most part, it actually lost a lot of features rather than gained a lot of features.
That sort of leads me into a few user-submitted questions from Illy on the Bethesda forums. Deus Ex Machina has a huge sense of scale. What influenced you to think so big?
Two things. The first and probably foremost thing is I really didn't realize how big I was making things at the time. When I first made the train, I thought it was going to be the size of a normal train. Instead, it's like this huge broad gauge locomotive that looks like it belongs appropriately in a fantasy or a science fiction game. From there, it was always about to make things as big and ridiculous as possible, which would kind of fit the whole theme of the mod in general. And part of that was actually inspired by Dark Pirate Lord's Greater Dwemer Ruins, because one of the cells he had in there was this big city, and I was really, really taken with how the scale and the size of things was just massive, and it really kind of appealed to me. And since then, I've always kind of had a thing to make all my mods really, really big in terms of physical scale. Make the player feel overwhelmed by the size of something.
I have noticed that a lot of your mods seem to be quite massive, and another question from Illy here is how much of your vision was impacted by your PC crash? And would you ever return to the mod and change or add anything?
Right, so what she's talking about is, for those who don't know, is that when I was almost complete with the development of Deus Ex Machina, my PC crashed, and unfortunately my backups were from way long ago. So I had to redo a significant portion of the mod. Now, my vision in terms of what I wanted to do wasn't affected too much. It was still the same quests, the same dungeons, but at the same time, I actually think it turned out for the better because I got to redo them with a lot more experience and in a lot better ways. Like, for example, Deus Ex Machina's final boss, the original one was kind of lackluster. You basically fought him in a square and he would like throw things at you, and it wasn't very interesting. And when after the crash, I went back and turned it into this, huge battle where he's got lasers and giant robots on top of a, huge moving train. And I think it turned out for the better. If I could go back and redo it, I probably wouldn't add anything simply because Deus Ex Machina had about 15 patches over the years, and quite a few of those completely overhauled it. For example, I completely redid the actual landscape, made it much more detailed and rocky. I redid a few portions of the city and quests to be more coherent or look better. So I really don't think there's anything I want to add to the mod.
Sort of going on to another one of your large projects, Sotha Sil Expanded is one of the many massive mods you've made or worked on over the years. But I'm sort of curious, what's the development history behind the project been like, and how many modders were involved in creating it?
Ooh. Well, the original idea is that after Darknuts GDR, which was, you might have seen a big inspiration for it for Sotha Sil Expanded, I had always wanted to do some sort of Sotha Sil GDR, like overhaul that final dungeon. So I was talking with a guy I know named Knots. You might have known him. He's Knots the Inane. He's done things like Something for Nobody and a few compilation mods. And he had actually approached me and said, hey, after Deus Ex Machina, you're clearly a very good modder. Do you want to do anything with me and another man named Alfarius, who was pretty much the best lore master I've ever known? And we were like, okay, I've always wanted to do something that expands upon Sotha Sil, because that's a really interesting part of the lore that never has gone into any particular detail. And originally it was just going to be a fairly not too big mod. It was obviously fairly sizable, but nothing on the scale that Sotha Sil Expanded ended up being. But somewhere down the line, we decided we wanted to really do the city justice. So we had the inception of the massive city, all these different parts, all the separate side quests. And at that point, it became clear that it was a bit too large even for, even for us to do. So I think somewhere along the line, Not started recruiting, and I started recruiting and trying to find people mostly to design the interiors for the city, because Sotha Sil in Sotha Sil Expanded has around 300 houses, and that's a lot of work, even for one person. So we had about, I'm going to say, 4 people who were working on the houses, and then other people wouldn't go. We had a person who designed a lot of the houses for us briefly. I believe Archmagister Antares, or I'm afraid I can't pronounce his name. He designed the living vending machine for us, and that was funny. And we had other few people for things like voice acting and music. So all in all, I think there was around, as far as a consistent team, maybe around 10 people, and maybe a few more who were just off just to do little things.
It is certainly a very impressive project. I actually think that Sotha Sil Expanded is probably larger than the Tribunal expansion itself, I think.
It is. We actually did a count. It's actually both larger than Tribunal and Blood Moon, though not combined. But Tribunal wasn't actually that big to begin with.
Oh no, it really wasn't. And I think the Clockwork City is what, like maybe 10, 15 Mournholds?
13 interior cells large, I believe.
Right, and it's a very iconic city design. You have the sort of cube shape, and then the players, they have this strange gravity bending system where you transport between districts, and you're on the wall or on the ceiling or on the floor of the cube, and it's very interesting.
That was actually inspired by Inception, the scene where Leonardo DiCaprio is teaching Juno how to manipulate the city and whatnot, and she turns the city into a cube. And when I saw that, I'm like, you know what? I want to make the city like that, and that's pretty much how it happened.
Now, one of the mods you released for Skyrim, Morrowind, is sort of your attempt to make the looting system of Skyrim a bit more like Morrowind. And I have to say that as a Morrowind player, one of my ultimate big disappointments with Oblivion and Skyrim was definitely the looting system and the fact that it just wasn't very unique. Have you had much success in converting Skyrim players over to this older way of doing things, and do you think Bethesda will ever return to a more unique looting system that Morrowind had in perhaps future games?
I really hope they do. Fallout 3 had given me serious hope for Skyrim because it had so much unique loot, and ultimately I, of course, ended up disappointed. But I do believe quite a few Skyrim players at least saw the benefit of hand-placed unique treasures, because I would see a lot of people complaining because somehow they couldn't get 15 Daedric armors for whatever reason. But at the same time, I saw a lot of people commenting how it felt really, really good to clear some really hard dungeon and look up and find behind a trash can, that Daedric sword. And I think that was always kind of the appeal of Morrowind, and why a lot of people, even though it's probably not true, they thought the dungeons were better. It's not so much the designs of Morrowind's dungeons that we've ever loved, but the fact that there is so much treasure and just random things to collect and find. And people seem to like to be rewarded. They don't like to go through a big long dungeon and at the end get 15 gold and a carrot. They want to be rewarded for their efforts, and I feel that Morrowind, more so than the other two Elder Scrolls games, very much had that.
Oh yeah, Morrowind had a lot of interesting, unique loot placement. I remember the enchanted axe in the tree stump outside of Sedanine, and there was at least one tomb where there was like a bunch of gold and potions that were just stacked up on a ledge somewhere where you wouldn't normally look. And in another dungeon,
I think that was the Urshalaku burial tombs.
That might have been it. And there was another dungeon where there was like a very powerful enchanted artifact that was hidden behind a chest. You had no reason to look behind the chest, but if you did, you would have been rewarded with that very powerful and unique item.
Those were the Fist of Randagulf in, I forgot the name, Ilanubi or whatever. And that was all very, very appealing to Morrowind for me. I liked, if you search every nook and cranny, you will find something neat. And a lot of the other games have that. Skyrim is much better than Oblivion. It has unique items that are hidden throughout the world, but it's not to the level of Morrowind, and I feel that it suffers for that, especially because its world is much more handcrafted than the earlier two games.
Oh yes, it was definitely one of my major disappointments. I really like the concept of rewarding the player for spending the time to actually explore and experience the dungeons they're delving in. Now, you also have a couple of real-time transportation mods, and I was kind of curious, were these influenced at all from Abbott's real-time mods from Morrowind?
Oh, yes. I think sometime in like a few months before I started on Transpotato, which was that real-time transportation mod, I was walking outside of Satanin and I see this big thing pass overhead and I freak out. I'm like, what the heck is that? And I realized that Abbott had actually scripted Silt Striders to come into port. And for some reason that kind of blew my mind, even though it wasn't that complicated of a thing. Because in Morrowind we kind of take for granted that the world is pretty static. NPCs stand around, and I thought that his real-time mods would only, allow you to travel in real time. I didn't realize that they would add gondoliers and ships and silt striders that would move throughout the world and let you give the illusion that the world was in some way moving about. And when that happened, I was like, I really want to do that for Skyrim. I want to see ships pulling out of ports, and because I have a train fetish, I want to see drummer trains traveling in the high ruins. And that last part was kind of a joke, but the ship part was always meant to be taken more seriously. Even in the end, though, I feel like it didn't work as well as Abbott's mods.
Oh yes, Abbott's mods are very impressive. They really pull you into the world and sort of immerse you into the sort of strange landscape of Morrowind.
Yep, that's why I have personally recommended his mods on all my guides. I can't think I've ever been disappointed with any of his mods.
Oh yes, so they're all very technically impressive, and sort of going into that, you also have a mod called Rideable Netch, which I guess could be kind of similar to Abbott's Rideable Gauze mod.
Actually, I think Rideable Netch was literally, I threw that together in about an hour because I saw a net and I wanted to ride it. And that got really, really popular for how little effort it took to make. It was kind of funny how much Skyrim players like the idea of just getting on top of a netch and just riding it around.
Oh, it certainly sounds like a lot of fun. And another question I've got is, what was the inspiration for the Doom train that you see in the real-time trains transport mod?
Oh, God. So the Doom train originally came from Final Fantasy. It was, you could summon it and it would hit one of your enemies and do a lot of damage. So I wanted to just recreate that as a joke, and I was wanting people, like, when it goes by, it would yell in this hellish voice, Doom Train. And so I had asked some of my friends if they could do just yell Doom Train in the most demonic voice possible. And so one guy kind of did pretty well, and that's the first voice you hear. But the other guy, who does a really good Elmo impression, did the voice. And I was like, okay, the mod's already a joke mod, putting in Elmo screaming Doom Train, wouldn't hurt. And that's what I did. So I don't think it was one particular inspiration. I think it was started off as me just trying to copy something from Final Fantasy shamelessly, and then a spur of the moment idea by one of my voice acting friends kind of turned it into a silly joke. Honestly, is how most of my mods go about.
Well, it is certainly very amusing, and sort of going into the trains theme here. This is a question from Dragon32 on the forums. Are you a big train buff in real life?
I actually work as a conductor, so my day job is running trains. So I do love trains, that's why I'm a conductor. But it's not just me being a train buff, is I am actually a train worker, so
Oh, makes sense. And one of your most popular mods for Morrowind is the main quest enhancers. And I've noticed this was sort of your response to the static nature of the main quest, and in many ways the static nature of the world of Morrowind, where the world didn't really change much aside from, the frequency of blight storms and the occasional dreamer that you might run into on the road. Looking back on it now, is there anything you think should still be added to Morrowind to make it feel more alive and that the world is actually changing with the main quest?
in terms of the main quest, I feel like main quest enhancers did what I wanted to do, because Morrowind's main quest is a bit more passive than Oblivion or Skyrim. Dagothar's grip on the world is very concrete, but at the same time, it's not particularly all the way out there. Morrowind had some stuff already. You would have dreamers approach you in the streets, talking about how they're going to rise up and kill some Imperials. And it didn't quite accurately portray the idea that this evil demon god is slowly taking over Morrowind, but it almost there. So main quest enhancers mostly was there to just push it over to the edge, to make it seem like, okay, clearly things are going, tits up, and that's not very good. But I don't think I would particularly add anything more to make the world feel like it's changing in response to the main quest any more than I already have. However, I probably would add things to make Morrowind itself feel alive. Then again, probably not, because I feel like a lot of mods that exist already, especially Abbott's mods, Animated Morrowind, and Living Cities of Vardenfell, do a very good job of making the world feel a lot less static, even if they don't necessarily do all that much. It's very much the concept of smoke and mirrors, the illusion that the world is alive, even though it not necessarily is.
Ah, very true. It's just, it seems to me that the Morrowind main quest doesn't, put much imperative on forcing you along to actually doing the main quest. It's like as, time goes on, you occasionally get approached by a dreamer, but I think it took me like 2 years to actually complete the main quest. I didn't really feel the pressure to sort of stop this big looming evil.
True, which is what main quest enhancers was trying to achieve a bit more. It was to remind you, hey, there is this, half-naked god up in a mountain, and he's going to turn you all into Cthulhu monsters if you don't stop him. But at the same time, I feel like the thing where the player is not pressed into finishing the main quest was a conscious design choice, and it probably was on Bethesda's behalf. And I think that's all, it actually was trying to strike a good balance of something that feels urgent, like you need to complete it, but there's still that little tiny footnote that reads, you know what, if you want to go off and, kill guars and pick ash yams, you can do that.
Yeah, yeah, I think it does handle it a bit better than maybe Skyrim does, which, as soon as you accidentally meet the Jarl in Whiterun, I think it is, and all of a sudden you're thrown onto the main quest and there's dragons everywhere.
Exactly. There is a balance when it comes to these kinds of main quests where you need to strike up the urgency versus not roping the player into these main quests. And Skyrim, basically, its biggest indicator of the main quest were the dragons. And after the first 15 dragons, you kind of get annoyed after a while. And the main quest doesn't really do a good job of, I think, anything really. Oblivion, in my opinion, was also the same way. It was very obvious, as you progress through the main quest, more and more Oblivion gates start popping up. But unfortunately, Oblivion gates were also very interrupting to your own personal adventures. You'd be walking along and then suddenly the sky turns red, and a dinosaur will come lumbering after you, and it's like, great, I have to go pull a ball out of this hellhole. And I think Morrowind probably struck the best balance. But again, main quest enhancers was there to very much even it out.
Oh yes, it does seem like the main quests of Oblivion and Skyrim were just sort of, well, cookie cuttered together from Oblivion in particular for Skyrim's case, and I really hope they do something a bit different for Elder Scrolls 6.
One can only hope.
Now, a lot of your Skyrim mods tend to have a pretty big Morrowind influence overall, from Morrowloot to the Vivek follower to the Sotha Sil mask, Doomer Spectres, and, well, honestly, just about all of your mods, really. Is there some element, or perhaps many elements of Morrowind that you prefer to the vanilla experience of Skyrim?
I don't think that Skyrim or Morrowind are superior to one another. I feel that Morrowind does a lot of things right, and Skyrim does a lot of things right, and vice versa, they do a lot of things wrong. But the things Morrowind did right are things that personally appeal to me, and I really liked Morrowind's, just the depth of its world, combined with the feeling that, for some reason, I actually like the idea that everyone hates me. At least starting out. Nobody gives me directions, everyone calls me names, and at the very end of that, I like the idea that I had to earn my respect and I had to earn my rewards. I had to figure things out on my own. And so that's why a lot of my mods are filled with really mean people that come to respect you and don't give you much direction. And visually, I also preferred Morrowind, but I think that goes without saying that a lot of people do. Morrowind had a much more alien feel to it, and it was much more unique, even though it obviously took inspirations from real life things. And Skyrim is good, though. I like a lot of Skyrim stuff, but if I had to choose between Morrowind's, not very good combat, and copy and pasted dungeons, but alien world and emphasis on trying to figure things out yourself and just kind of presenting the information there and letting you discover the world on your own, I would prefer Morrowind.
You sort of raise an interesting point with Skyrim, that Skyrim does do a lot of things better than Morrowind. And is there anything in particular you think that maybe a mod that doesn't exist yet should improve on Morrowind that was in Skyrim?
If I would say any mod that needs to exist, it would be a lot more dungeon overhauls, because even though the loot in Morrowind's dungeons, like I said, that's the most important part of the dungeon, I feel, even though the loot is very good, the actual dungeon designs are always very lackluster. For example, Ancestor Tombs only have about, 10 or 12, maybe even less, templates that they actually pull from and modify. And I feel like if there's a mod that needs to exist, it would be one that makes dungeons at least visually and mechanically a bit more interesting. They don't have to be longer, because I think a good benefit Morrowind had with its much smaller dungeons is that you don't get tired of them. I call that dungeon fatigue, and it's kind of a problem in a lot of games. But at the same time, I feel like they should have something more interesting about them, and they often don't. Which is something I think Skyrim succeeds in that even though their dungeons are a bit longer, can be a blessing and a curse, it makes much more of an effort to have a lot more unique dungeons. And I can think of a lot more unique dungeons in Skyrim than I can in Morrowind. But like I said, I still prefer Morrowind for its loot.
Yes, quite right. It does seem like the dungeons in Morrowind, well, they're not exactly unique, and they're also not exactly particularly detailed. In fact, it's like the object counts in one of Morrowind's dungeons compared to a Skyrim dungeon is significantly less. And what do you think of more aesthetic overhauls of Morrowind's dungeons, like Logan's Caverns overhaul?
I like those as well. Like I said, preferably I'd like things that are more mechanical overhauls, like maybe adding some sort of puzzle or something unique that happens when you enter a tomb or cave. But visual overhauls are just as valid, and I think just as good. Because in a game about exploration, sights can be just as interesting as loot, though of course, given Morrowind and all Elder Scrolls games' modular design, you have to be kind of careful there. But I think Logan's Cavern overhaul, what little I've used of it, has been very good about that. Quite pretty.
Sort of going on to another one of your Morrowind mods, was Racer Recursion you taking revenge on mod users?
Ah. Racer Recursion was a bit like the Doom Train in that it was a bit of a spur of the moment thing. I can't remember the exact thought process that led me to make Racer Recursion. I think alcohol might have been involved, or painkillers, but I can't be certain. But I think before that, I had done something where I made Cliff Racers 10 times normal size. So I already had a bit of Cliff related sadism in me already. I'm not, like I said, I am not particularly sure what led to the inception of Racer Recursion, but I can say it was not me taking revenge on Morrowind users. Skyrim users, I might do something like that, but Morrowind people, I've never had any particular ill will towards them, despite what Racer Recursion might imply.
Now, I am sort of curious. There's been another sort of strange Cliff Racer mod that was released not that long ago called Fire Breathing Cliff Races. Would you ever consider combining Fire Breathing Cliff Races with Racer Recursion, perhaps throwing in some burdening spells and maybe constant invisibility?
I've considered it at some point, but then I realized I don't hate anyone that much.
Well, sort of on that note, after so many insane mods, from meteor trains to unending duplicating cliff races, there are some in the modding community who consider you to sort of be the embodiment of Sheogorath made flesh. Would you agree with that statement?
Sheogorath, I think, is much more insane than I. My if I would be anyone, I would probably be sanguine. I'm the personification of insane hedonism. Everything I do is because I simply kind of want to do it and be entertained by it, even if it means raining down meteor trains on Whiterun. That being said, I do think there are some people in the modding community who are way more insane than I.
I don't know. It does seem like you make the headlines for insanity quite often.
I don't know, the guy who did that Tommy Wiseau horse and the talking guard helmets and the sloth follower, I think, is a bit more insane than I am. Plus, he has the modeling skill that I don't to actually make his insane visions come to life.
Ah, fair enough. And another modding question. What draws you to modding video games?
I think the first video game I ever actually modded was Train Simulator, the really, really old, like 2000 Microsoft one. And growing up, I didn't actually have a lot of games to play. I know, boo-hoo, poor me. But a lot of the games I did play, I tried to extend their longevity as much as possible. So discovering the fact that I could modify and create my own stuff in games really sort of appealed to me. I'm a bit of a control freak, and I really like the idea that I have a lot more control of my games and that I can create my own adventures. So I've always been both very supportive of modding in games and like modding games myself.
You know, for some reason, I was expecting to be more surprised to hear that your first game that you modded was a train simulator, but I'm just not. It seems kind of predictable, honestly.
It's less of what you might think. It was more that that was the only game I had at the time that had accessible editing tools. Because all my other games, it was like I'd have to go into text files and learn programming, and I was a kid at this point. I didn't know any of that. But the Microsoft Train Simulator tools, it's almost similar to, basic Elder Scrolls stuff where it's very much drag and drop and very visually based, something a kid of that age could very much do.
You know, it is kind of interesting. A lot of people still think that modding involves a lot of major programming, and so they're kind of intimidated to even really get involved with it. When, as you said, with Elder Scrolls modding, it's a lot of that drag and drop aspect.
Even if you go into mods that don't have nice tools like that, there's very, very little programming in all the games I've modded that has to be done. And I think the games I modded was a space game called Freelancer, which still remains my personal favorite game. And that game, everything was text-based, like you had to do command lines and stuff, and even that wasn't programming. It was just soul-crushing, tedious, copying line by line and modifying little values here. And even though you probably had to have a lot of willpower to do it, you didn't need a lot of programming skill. So I always say to people, if you want to mod, it's pretty easy to learn. If you want a script, you probably need a little bit of programming background, but just making armor and weapon and even house mods, that does not take programming skill.
Oh no, definitely, and it always baffles me how people sort of build up modding to be a bigger challenge than it actually is.
I think that might result people having misconceptions about mods, either seeing all mods as something where, it turns everyone into boobs and all dragons into Thomas the Tank Engine, or all these mods are something that does incredible wizard magic. People will think of things like Sky UI or Enderall, things that are quite complex or look quite complex, and because they think, just like video games, it takes a lot of programming to do, that somehow the same thing applies here. You need a lot of programming knowledge or some computer wizardry to do the things that they see are happening when it really is not.
Oh yeah, and a lot of that just really boils down to the willpower, especially for, larger projects. It's like Tower Built, probably their biggest challenge is just the interiors, because, you have thousands and thousands of interiors to do, and you have to design each one to be sort of unique. That's, like, the real barrier. It's not programming, it's repetition, so to speak.
Oh yeah, that was a problem with Sotha Sil Expanded. Even 300 houses, after a while, it was very difficult to see, okay, I need to think up something to put in this house and this house. And I kind of got mad later on when people would say that, they were mad because not every building in the Clockwork City had something going on with it. And I was like, there are 300 houses. Not everything is going to have a quest. Still tried.
Oh yes, definitely. It does take quite a bit of work to make each building unique, especially in large numbers. And, sort of going on to another question, you're a prominent member of both the Morrowind and Skyrim modding communities. Are there any major cultural differences between the two, and is there one you prefer overall?
Well, the Skyrim community, at least the earliest and more prominent modders, grew out of the Oblivion community, which in turn grew out of the Morrowind community. So there are a lot of similarities between the two. But I think the biggest difference is just the sheer size and pace of Skyrim's modding community versus Morrowind's community. Morrowind's community is, don't get me wrong, still very active, but a lot of the people here are, most of them are not new. They are veterans. There's a much more sense of community. They're much more tighter knit, much more willing to share resources. And to be fair, there's not a lot of attention that gets put on Morrowind modding in comparison to Skyrim modding. Skyrim modding is like the Hollywood of modding. It's the biggest thing out there. You will see news articles still getting written about Skyrim modding. You know, you have these big, huge projects that get national media attention. And because of that, there's a lot less personal nature, I feel. It can lead to a lot bigger drama storms, but at the same time, it also means that there's also an oversaturation of just not a lot of people communicating with each other. You'll see some tight-knit groups come about here and there, but it seems more and more in the Skyrim community that things are a bit more impersonal. People are just releasing mods here and there. Luckily, at the same time, because they've spawned from the original TS modding community, most people do share resources freely, which is a lot better than some modding communities I know. So thankfully, it still retains some good traits from the earlier modding communities.
Now, I was sort of curious because I've overheard rumors before of there being a lot of theft of mods in the Skyrim modding community. Is that actually a thing?
You know, I've really not seen a lot of modding theft. The biggest drama that seems to come about is people just criticizing or talking about other mod authors behind their back. That's where the majority of the drama seems to come from, but resource stealing, I really, really don't see it. And when it happens, it's usually A, rare, and B, very brief. You'll see someone post, hey, this guy stole my thing, and then it's gone, and that's it. There's no drama that seems to actually amount over that. The idea that somehow people are fighting over resources doesn't particularly seem to happen because, like I said, there seems to be a lot more openness to share resources, even if it's not always explicitly stated. But if you just ask someone permission, they almost always say yes. So a lot of my mods just use resources from other people's mods.
So would you say that the Skyrim modding community, despite being, pretty large, is still fairly structured with, rules and permissions, kind of like the Morrowind modding community?
Oh yeah, I think a lot of sort of honor things and unspoken modder codes that kind of started to exist in the Morrowind modding community, and then the Oblivion modding community, and then obviously the Skyrim modding community still exists. There's things you just don't do, and thankfully it's helped modding community stay pretty good. But at the same time, of course, there's always drama and storms here and there that thankfully are weathered, at least until recently, maybe.
Oh yes, yeah, speaking of recently, with the paid mods fiasco, I know that in the first episode of Morrowind Modding Podcast that you were, pretty strongly opposed to paid mods. But now that the whole thing has, sort of been cancelled, how do you feel about the future of the modding community, and do you think paid mods is something that might affect the Elder Scrolls and Fall games in the future?
I personally am still 100% against paid mods. I cannot see any situation where that won't turn out somewhat bad. But at the same time, I think now that the idea is out there, that is, the idea has actually been out for a while. What if they start charging for mods, But now that the idea is concretely out there and that they did try to do that, I feel like there is going to be somewhere down the line some sort of monetization involved in modding. And I don't see that as a good thing. I see that as very much undermining a lot of the free resource sharing that both Skyrim, Morrowind, Oblivion, and pretty much any Bethesda game modding community relies on. And I feel like it's going to lead to a lot bigger drama and a lot more broken hearts, to say the least. And we've already seen it happen in this particular incident. We saw actual legal action being taken, which was something that really never happened, but now that money started to get involved, it will. And I just feel like something that has always been free, at least for the Elder Scrolls, should remain free. And when you try to introduce money into that equation, just nothing is going to get good.
Oh yeah, and something that, wasn't really mentioned much during the paid mods crisis, but still happened, is the fact that a lot of Morrowind modders actually took down their modder resources for fear that they would be taken and used in a Skyrim mod that was, a paid mod. And, that's sort of the problem, especially with the Elder Scrolls community, is that you have a lot of this cross-sharing of resources between the games. You find Morrowind resources in both Skyrim and Oblivion, and Oblivion and Skyrim resources are often also ported back into Morrowind, so you have all this cross-sharing between communities, and if you introduce paid mods into that concept, it kind of affects the entire thing.
It doesn't just affect the entire thing between communities, it affects things within communities. Like I said, most of my mods are made with other people's resources. I mean, I can't think of any large-scale quest mod that doesn't use someone else's resources. And it would be like, if you remove that from the equation, some people might think that introducing money into the equation somehow makes the mod quality go up. But what you're doing is you're also closing off a lot of free things and resources that people might have been willing to share with you if you were a non-paid mod. That gets closed off. So you end up having to have maybe a big paid quest mod would have to do everything in-house. They'd have to get modelers, they'd have to get their own textures, their own voice artists, music people. And when it gets to that, if you combine that with the fact that they aren't making much money to begin with, it becomes a question of these people are professionals, and if they have this team to do all this, why would they not just play an actual game?
And sort of another flaw with the higher quality mods idea is that, with a lot of modding projects, people do this because they want to, and all of a sudden, if you want to start a major modding project like Beyond Skyrim, and you have to actually pay all of your members, and you have the problem that all of your members actually have to contribute to the mod or else they won't get paid, and it becomes this really confusing mess of who actually gets paid what amount for the work they've done, and it's really hard to conceive of how a large modding project would benefit from paid mods in any way.
Exactly that. It's the minute you introduce money, you're opening a huge can of problems that we as a modding community just really cannot deal with. And I feel like Valve and Bethesda even did not understand the nature of Morrowind and Skyrim and all the TES game modding communities, and they were trying to apply the logic that exists for Team Fortress 2 or Dota 2, which is they do sell cosmetics there, but they don't seem to fully understand that they are different communities. It's almost like a different culture. If you what sells in Europe does not necessarily sell in Japan. And if you try and use the same styles there, you're going to screw up. And they did not understand that. And unfortunately, I think a lot of news sites also didn't understand that. They were ganging up on people against paid modding, thinking that somehow it was, oh, it wasn't about compensating the modders, and the 130,000 people who signed this petition were all trolls. And they never seemed to actually interview someone who was against modding and an actual Skyrim modder. And it kind of made me mad.
Oh yes, the mainstream gaming press seems to do this, a lot. They don't actually get people that are from the other side that are modders, and it seems like, to me anyway, that the majority of modders were actually clearly against paid mods to begin with. And it kind of baffles me that the argument for paid mods, that a lot of the people were, just claiming the other side were all entitled children, when in fact many of the opposing side were in fact modders.
Exactly, and that was also it seemed like they were kind of trying to push a narrative that only random, 13-year-olds who had no money were against paid modding, when it was very clear that pretty much the biggest proponents against paid modding were actual modders. Thankfully, some people were a bit more fair, but at the same time, was kind of annoying. Thankfully, I was very impressed, though still kind of mad, that Valve actually recanted paid modding. That's something you really don't see happen a lot. It was like, really? You guys are actually keeping your word and saying that you're taking down paid modding if a bunch of people don't like it? That's a first.
Oh yeah, it was definitely a relief when they did that. There was a lot of worry that this would become permanent and what this would have, what sort of effect this would have on the community in the long term, because certainly in the short term there was very little positive effects from paid mods.
Pretty much. I think it's pretty clear at this point that the proponents that were for paid modding were a lot less than the people who were against it.
Oh yes, definitely. And sort of moving on to another subject, aside from making mods, I believe you're also working on a game of your own called Nano Steam, and I'm not entirely sure about this, but I believe it's a massively multiplayer role-playing train simulator game where players can choose a class of train to play as and collect Steam as currency. And I hear that there's also PvP features as well, where you can do train jousting. And can you tell us a bit about those features?
I'm pretty sure that that's not what the game is about. Now, Nano Steam is, like I said, it is a game I'm making, and there are trains, but Nano Steam is, I'd almost want to consider it my magnum opus. It is an open world first person RPG, kind of similar to an Elder Scrolls game because I like those games. But it's science fiction and it's got a very large emphasis on exploration and boss fights. So Nano Steam is what I've always wanted to make in a game. It's taking all the features I like from other stuff and kind of mashing them together and trying to make them work. And so far it's been pretty successful. So Nanosteam is this very detailed science fiction world that the player is free to explore and free to get killed by killer bridges and evil mountains and that sort of thing. And it's got, to anyone listening, it very much has my trademark ridiculousness in it. But at the same time, we've tried to make it just the best it can possibly be. Like I said, it is, I have poured my heart and soul into it. If you think Sotha Sil Expanded was good, this will hopefully blow you away, because this is the thing that it is my baby, and I have worked very hard to make sure it's good.
So, speaking of, ridiculous concepts, so train jousting, that is in, right? We'll be able to ride trains and use them as jousting mounts?
Well, there's a train-to-train battle at one point, and there's two pretty significant quests that involve trains, but I don't think there's train jousting. I will spoiler a bit for you and say that there is an ability you get later on in the game if you do the right quests, in that there is a settlement, a city that has a lot of intercommunal trains, and if you befriend them and help them out, you will get a special ability where if some guy is standing on the tracks while you're fighting them, you can snap your fingers and a train will come rushing down and hit him for massive damage. It's kind of hard to pull off, but when you do, it's quite funny.
That almost sounds like the Doom train, and sort of another question I have about your game is that how big is it in comparison to, say, the games we're used to, like Fallout and the Elder Scrolls series? I mean, how big would you say is the world?
I've never been good at estimating size or time. It's kind of my biggest flaw. But the world itself, I can't fully say how big it is because the way we set the game up is sort of similar to, did you ever play some of the old Fallouts, Fallout 1 and 2 or Arcanum, perhaps?
I personally have not.
Okay, so the way they handled their world is that you basically had an animation of you going from point of interest to point of interest. Those points were actual maps you could explore, but between them the overworld was either randomly generated or it was forced you into a fast travel screen. It's sort of like Daggerfall in that sense. So the world is actually the entire world, but it's only the points of interest that you can visit. That's partially because we're a small team and we couldn't create the entire world, and also because I really want to focus more on the actual locations and the place between them. I'm not too concerned over whether the player looks at a rock or something, but I do want the player, when they arrive at interesting locations, I do want those locations to be detailed. And there are quite a few of them. I think at last count we had around 200, not counting things like cities or towns. But like I said, the actual size of the map, I can't say, and I don't think I can ever get an accurate number because there is no technical map. It's different point of interest maps separated by a fast travel screen. And that fast travel screen is actually a lot more you have to, if you want, set up camp, manage supplies, fend off killer bridges, that sort of thing. But at the same time, I think it's a good balance of what we're trying to do of detailed versus not detailed.
So the in between aspects of places, is that sort of randomly generated? Is there different types of environments like forests and deserts and the like?
Because it is the entire world, we can have a huge variety of environments, and we do, thankfully. But as you're traveling between points of interest, that is map markers, it's mostly just an animation. You see your character traveling across the wastelands, and random events do happen, which will take you down into a random map where some event will take place. But for the most part, you cannot seamlessly travel between locations. I know that might disappoint some people, but I'm not too particularly beat up over it. They can just mod it in.
Now, I'm sort of curious, how long has this game been in production so far? I know I've been seeing a few videos here and there on your YouTube channel for a while now.
If we take production as me planning and programming things, then about 10 years. It's only really got into serious production for about 2 years now, and that was me formally founding the company, starting to hire people, and starting to get actual assets made. But as far as my own work, which is maps, the engine, the design systems, even just a little bit of programming here and there, that has been about 10 years. Like I said, I have poured a lot of stuff into this trying to get this made, and I've put a lot of detail into everything. Hopefully that will pay off and people enjoy it.
Oh yeah, that definitely sounds like you've been at this for a while. I mean, that was before even Oblivion came out, I think. And sort of another user-submitted question here from Hane2 on Reddit. How much have you learned about game design from making mods?
I think some people out there, not a lot, but some people kind of dismiss mods as being not real game design, which is funny to me because you see game modders getting hired by game companies all the time. And the fact of the matter is that the exact same conventions, rules that apply in formal game design apply to modding too. And so even though you're not programming, which is a very important part of game design, learning how systems interact, learning what types of level designs work and what types don't, learning to navigate in 3D spaces, and all the essential skills that you actually need as a game designer very much apply and very much can be taught through modding. So I have learned a lot about game design from making mods, apart from just experience, and partially from just seeing, if I do this, does this work? If I do this, does this work? And I think I always got to say that game design and modding both gateways to each other. And if you want to learn game design, even people in the professional industry that I know and are friends with, they will say it's a very valid way to do it. At the same time, it's important that you should probably make your own games as well.
Oh yeah, I remember with the documentary for Oblivion, I think it was. It's like the guy who made all the dungeons, and you got to feel bad for that guy. He was just one person making hundreds of dungeons, and you can see. Yeah, I know those dungeons were terribly cookie cutter, and you can see him using like basically the construction set to make those dungeons.
Exactly. And they have said, and I believe it, that the construction set is basically a watered down version of the tools they use to make games. And if you are an actual game developer and you've ever opened up some sort of proprietary engine software to make a level or something, you'll find that the things inside and the tools are remarkably similar to a lot of modding tools. Because modding essentially is just game design, but you didn't actually make the game in the first place. And you have to wonder, okay, it might actually, say someone is working on an expansion pack for Elder Scrolls, aren't they technically modding the game just with more powerful tools?
Oh yeah, and another question, again from Hane2, is do you feel the ideas and methods you use for your Elder Scrolls mods can be applied to your non-modding projects, which I guess, sort of goes into the game design with Nanosteam there?
Definitely. Like I saying, what works for modding works for game design, especially given how Nano Steam and the Elder Scrolls series will have a lot of similarities to each other. I think The biggest one we've probably borrowed from Elder Scrolls is the concept of modular level design, which is a brilliant tactic for making very large open world games, and it's something that we're applying in Nanosteam, combined with a little on-the-fly original meshing in dungeons. So I would say very much so that what you learn in modding can be applied, to game design. I don't think it would ever be any other way.
Now, sort of going into a different set of questions here. These are more general modding questions. Do you do any planning before you start a mod? And if yes, how?
I do a lot of planning before I ever start a mod. You may have, I don't know if I have a reputation for this or not, but I produce, except for Deus Ex Machina, mods really quick, and I attribute that to planning. Before I go into a mod, I write out the dialogue, I draw out all the maps, and I mostly write all the scripts. So I know from the start what I want to do, what needs to go where, and what needs to happen. And I feel like that's an essential part of anything in both game design and modding that you need to do. The more you plan, the faster you get it done. So yeah, I do a lot of planning. My computer has a lot of just, scanned in maps and stuff of the different levels I've made through both modding and game design, as well as a lot of text files that have all the dialogue.
Oh yeah, I think a lot of massive projects, sort of run into that problem is that they don't do enough planning ahead of time. Like when we were talking with Haplo the other week, he mentioned that the problem with Tamari built and why it's been taking so long to do the Morrowind mainland is that they sort of rushed into it and for years didn't really have any established planning. So only just now are they really getting into the major planning phase in order to, streamline things to be faster in the future.
Right. I think a major part of if you go into a big mod project like that, I think it's really, really essential that you need to have a very concrete vision of anything before you start doing any serious work.
Oh yes, and that has cost major projects like that a ton of time in having to redo things. And going on to another question, have you been influenced by any non-Elder Scrolls games when you mod?
I would say definitely. I'm trying to think of one particular influence that might stand out recently. Wheels of Lull. I had just started that after playing I Divine Cybermancy, which was ridiculously stupidly weird. And you might notice if you've ever played Wheels of Lull that one of the weapons you get is a sword that causes explosions. And that was directly inspired by I Divine Cybermancy's explosion sword, which I still don't understand, but I liked it, so I added it in. So if I see something in another game or somewhere else that I like or a mechanic that I like, I will try to add it into a mod somehow. For example, Sotha Sil Expanded, I think a lot of people noted that it had a very large Portal 2 inspiration for it, because I don't think I had recently played Portal 2, but I had liked a lot of the elements there, and I felt like Portal 2 with its giant ever-changing facility really matched up with the description of Sotha Sil being a giant ever-changing clockwork facility.
Now, for some reason, I thought you were going to say, a train simulator again as one of your influences for when you mod.
I think train simulators really don't influence me. There's a misconception that I like train simulators. I kind of don't. I already work on trains, and you don't really get the same rush you do from a simulator. Most of my time in Microsoft Train Simulator was me modding it so that they would turn into battle trains and putting them on ridiculous layouts and basically sending them to die, which says a lot about me and why I should probably never be behind the controls of a locomotive, but I'm already a conductor, so kind of screwed that up.
Yeah, you're sort of terrifying me right now. I'm definitely going to make sure I never ride on a train again. And speaking about influences, are there any modders who have inspired or influenced you in some way? I mean, obviously, I think you mentioned Darknut and Abbott.
Well, not one particular modder, but in a lot of mods, if I see something set up some way and I think it's brilliant, or like, oh man, you're using, this table as a bridge, and it's like, wow, why didn't I think of that? I will totally use something similar. It's like I said, modding by its very nature is very open, and I see a lot of things that I am inspired by, and I try to incorporate similar elements into my mods, and I see a lot of mods also that are clearly inspired by my work. And I think that's a good system that we have, that it's kind of a non-formal, informal sharing of ideas. So I would say Abbott and Dark have definitely been major inspirations for a lot of my mods, but also just a lot of little modders here and there. And there are modders that, even though they don't inspire me, I still love their work just because they're so freaking crazy. Like, there is a Japanese modder who is named M150, and he does Skyrim stuff, and he puts in things like orbital missile strikes and tanks, and that's just hilarious.
Oh yes, and then there's also Autoclock, and he's been doing his crazy gear mods on Tumblr recently.
Yep, I've definitely been helping him out and looking forward to that, especially because, as he clearly understands, the way my heart is through trains, so I'm very much looking forward to getting run down by his giant Doom train.
Oh yes, it'll be great to finally see a Morrowind Doom train. And sort of going into another question, what modding projects are you currently working on? I know you're working on something for Fallout, which I believe also involves trains.
Of course, that is New Vegas Railroads. I was kind of mad that New Vegas, even though it has canonically trains that are supposed to be moving about and shipping goods up to Boulder Dam, I was really, really, really mad about that. So I decided to fix it because that's kind of how I work. But I also kind of wanted to do a little more for my first mod, and because I saw that the poor Fallout modders seemed starved for a lot of content and quest mods. So right now, as it stands, it's a content and immersion mod. After you do some basic stuff, you can travel to the NCR's major New Vegas rail hub, which is called Bullhead, and it's got a lot of little details and a lot of little side quests, and you can reactivate trains. And once you give them the all clear, you'll see trains running throughout the Mojave in real time. So that's my New Vegas mod, and I have one Skyrim mod that's on the burner right now that might see fruition sometime in the next 20 years, which is, I've developed already scripted a system that allows the player to, when they fall asleep, have interactive dreams, sort of similar to how you might have disturbing dreams in Morrowind, but they're actual scenes that play out. And so, like I said, the scripts for that already exist, but none of the dreams do. And that might see fruition sometime soon, but my precedent goes to New Vegas Railroads and especially Nanosteam.
Now, sort of out of curiosity, how much time would you say you spend per week or possibly month modding?
I don't spend a lot of time constantly modding. It'll usually be like maybe once a week, but it'll be in a very long session, maybe 8 hours, 5 hours, all day with a lot of caffeine, something like that. But it's never too consistently day after day. I kind of have trouble doing something like that, at least in terms of modding, and it's always kind of been a problem for me. But I don't spend very long, as much as people might think, modding, though I do pour in a lot of hours. They're just in very large sessions, but never, like I said, day after day after day.
Oh yeah, it can be kind of difficult to, sort of have a regiment, uh, like a daily regiment of modding, like just do 30 minutes now and 30 minutes the next day. Creativity is kind of hard to manage in that respect.
Exactly. You can get burned out, and that's always kind of a problem with a lot of people, I feel. So I have to manage that time and just do it in long bursts rather than short bursts, because otherwise I kind of get sick of it.
Oh yeah, it sort of becomes more turned into work instead of, actually doing something you want to do, which another problem with paid mods is that it would basically turn modding into work.
And nobody wants to work.
Exactly, exactly. And this next question, I already kind of know the answer to it anyway, but do you listen to music while you mod? And if so, what do you like to listen to? I know on Tumblr you've said you like to listen to Two Steps from Hell, I believe it was.
Yep, I very much like orchestral stuff, and especially, bombastic, something you might hear in a trailer, which is what Two Steps from Hell is. That's the kind of music I like to listen to. And unfortunately, I do not like to listen to the Thomas the Tank Engine theme. I don't think anyone likes to listen to that except when they mash it up with rap music.
Oh yes, I also like to listen to Two Steps from Hell when I'm malting because that epic trailer music, it really makes sort of the repetitious stuff that you have to do for modding feel, just a bit more bearable.
Yep, it's very good for motivation, I feel. If anyone ever needs to be motivated to do something, they need to listen to Two Steps from Hell.
Now, I have another user-submitted question from the Bethesda forums here. It's from Leonardo. And how different was modding in Skyrim in comparison to Morrowind? But also, how has that affected you as a modder? I.e., learned new modding techniques, or perhaps got more inspiration when it comes to modding?
Skyrim modding and Morrowind modding, because they use very similar tool sets, weren't a lot different. There are a lot of things in Skyrim modding that, going back to Morrowind modding, I miss, mostly just basic functionalities. And I think I actually had to kind of unlearn a lot of things going to Skyrim modding, because I could find that, navigating this 3D space or placing these objects was a lot easier than it was in Morrowind. And I had come up with all these little systems I had created for just making things in Morrowind, stuff I didn't need to do anymore in Skyrim. But then coming back to Morrowind, I have automatically relearn these things because it's like, oh, right, I can't do this, I can't do that.
Oh yeah, a problem that I've noticed, especially with Skyrim and Oblivion mods, is that when going to Morrowind, it's, that object properties window, the one that you're supposed to hit save on in order to save the changes to an object in Oblivion and Skyrim. You're supposed to hit cancel in Morrowind, otherwise it creates this dirty reference, and it is very difficult for people coming from Skyrim or Oblivion to really know that at all.
Right, and the same applies with writing scripts as well. Papyrus, which is Skyrim's scripting language, is fundamentally different than Morrowind's scripting language. So when you go to Morrowind modding, you're like, right, I have to do this and that. But most of the time it's like, wait, I can't do this or that? That sucks! So at first, I kind of liked Morrowind modding more, but as I got more and more familiar with Skyrim's modding, I was like, yeah, okay, this is a lot better, and I miss a lot of features modding Morrowind from Skyrim's modding construction set. And I actually get mad when people say, oh, Skyrim Creation Kit is really, really bad. And I'm like, you guys have never actually used any other editing software, have you? This has a lot of functionality and frankly a lot of support, which is a lot better than some stuff I've used. I actually modding Freelancer for its star system modding tool. It has 2 delete everything buttons right next to its save button. And there's no shortcut for that save button. So you have to open the menu and click save every single time. I deleted all my star systems once or twice. After that, I just kind of hacked the program and removed that functionality.
Ouch, that does sound like pretty bad placement right there. And, going into what you were saying about, features being missing from Morrowind when compared to Skyrim modding, if you could make a single change to the capabilities of the construction set, what would it be?
Ooh, a single change. I would have to say give Skyrim's rendering window and shortcuts to Morrowind. Because the 2 big things that stand out to me when modding Skyrim is that you can hide objects. If you press the 1 key, objects will de-render. They're still technically there, and they'll be there next time you load that cell, but they aren't considered there by the engine currently. So if you make like an enclosed box and you want to modify something in that enclosed box, which I do a lot of, you can just hide key objects that might get in your way, and it makes things a lot easier. And relating to that, when you go to move things in Skyrim, you can hold down keys and you can click and drag arrows even if you can't see the object. That's very useful for object movement, like I said, when something's getting in the way. And you can't do either of those things in Morrowind, and it makes it really hard, especially when you are working with non-conventional level design and not making modular tileset stuff. There can be a lot of things where you kind of have to angle the camera awkwardly to try and modify things. And it's always been very infuriating for me, and it would definitely be something I want in the construction set, should I mod Morrowind.
Oh yeah, that was an issue that happened to me quite a lot, actually, is that I would try and do some fine detailing and, something would get in the way of the camera, and it can be just a little bit irritating in, sort of placing items and hand-rotating them to perfectly match surfaces, to not actually be able to quite see exactly what you're doing.
Exactly. And that's where the hide button comes in and the little arrow things, which probably have a name that I have forgotten.
Now, on a similar note, is there anything you'd change about the creation kit for Skyrim?
Creation kit. Not the creation kit as such, but the creation engine. One of the things that I do a lot of in Morrowind is synchronized object movement. Like, you've seen the big factory in Sotha Sil Expanded, the trains in Deus Ex Machina. That's not one object, that's all multiple objects moving at once. And it relies on that because Morrowind scripts are processed every frame. Skyrim, that is the creation engine, suspends scripts based on how much memory they're taking up, and it can lead it helps save memory, but it can lead to some weird things. And the biggest one is that I cannot do synchronized object movement with it. So originally, for example, Blackreach Railroad, the train tunnel would have been a lot more extensive. You would have gone over canals and bridges and a little boutique. It would have been quite nice. But unfortunately, I couldn't do that because they were all separate objects and things would get out of sync. So you'd somehow see like this flying boutique fly past you or a bridge not be where it's supposed to be. And if there's anything I would like to return, it would be the ability to process scripts every frame if I choose to, so that I could have synchronized object movement and I could do so much more with that.
Oh yeah, and Morrowind scripts are just a little bit weird in that respect. I mean, they're constantly looping, which is very strange. It's not something you would
Right.
expect to find.
It's an odd concept to wrap your head around, but it does have its advantages. And when you go to a system that does not have those advantages, even though it's objectively a better system, you kind of miss the ability to have those like the Sotha Sil conveyor belts or the big trains running through the sky, and you can't. It makes me sad.
Now, sort of going into another question, have you gotten any help from other modders with your mods? And if so, how have other modders helped you?
I think the biggest thing I usually have problems with are trying to do some sort of weird scripting thing or confirming a weird scripting thing. During the early days of Skyrim modding, when I was not familiar with Papyrus, I was on the forums a lot asking people scripting questions. These days, not so much. Might relate to something like trying to figure out how traps work in Skyrim, how to have object movement, or how to just write a script that does something really, really, really weird, which happens a lot with me. So I don't think one particular modder has helped me out. Guys on the creation kit forum and the construction set forum are always really helpful, so props to them.
Now, this is another question from Illy, and it is, how much do you use the community to get feedback and motivation for your mods?
I think we kind of heard this in the Morrowind Modding podcast, which is I do look at comments on an individual basis, and if there's something like the guy is complaining that Morrow loot took out all the loot from level lists, I ignore it. But I do kind of look at like what general comments are saying. Like if there's a bunch of comments that say that this thing is like it's broken or they don't like this thing, I will go back and change it. So I always try and get a general feel for what the community is saying rather than by looking at comments on an individual basis. So I do modify things and I do change things based on what people say. And at the same time, it is very nice to see things end up on File of the Month or Hot Files to help motivate me to mod. Though at the same time, most of the time, if I'm modding something, it's usually just because I want to add it in.
Now, since you brought it up, with hot files and the file of the month thing, it's, a lot of Morrowind modders, they kind of see that as being just a bit mercenary. They prefer the old Planet Elder Scrolls system. And, well, do you think that the older Planet Elder Scrolls system was maybe better than sort of the Nexus setup, or do you think the Nexus setup sort of encourages modders to try and achieve a higher quality?
I don't think there's anything wrong with File of the Month or the Hot File section. Those I don't mind. I do really I don't like the Nexus's rating system, and they've really butchered it over the years. It started off on a simple 1 to 10 thing. You have to write a review if you want to score it. And I think that always worked very well. It worked for Planet Elder Scrolls, and I never found anything wrong with the system. But then it changed to endorsements or negative endorsements, which again, I really didn't like. It just kind of seemed like something is good or bad, and that's very black and white. and then they removed negative endorsements because they were afraid of abuse, and then it was just basically up to endorsements. So it kind of becomes difficult to figure out how good a mod is. You can't look at endorsements because endorsements just say how many people thumbs up it. It's not a particularly good system for rating things. I liked Planet Elder Scrolls' system of the 1 to 10 rating better, but I don't particularly think the Hot Files and File of the Month is bad, though I might be slightly biased in that regard.
Oh yeah, the Nexus rating system, well, it's not exactly ideal. It's like if I'm writing a review for a mod and I've got a bunch of, legitimate issues that I'm pointing out for the modder, my only option is to not endorse or to endorse. And if I don't endorse, there's no guarantee that other players will actually find my review and be able to use that to make an sort of educated guess as to whether or not this mod will cause problems for them if they add it to their game.
Exactly. Well, there are mods up there that have thousands of endorsements, but they actually are not good. For example, the War Zones mod for the longest time would actually break your saves, and that had thousands of endorsements, but of course, how would you know if it broke your saves or not? There's no negative way to tell.
Oh yes, and it seems like, to me, I actually thought that Morrowind Summit, way back in the day, sort of had the best rating system, because they had they had a 6-point rating system, I think it was, and it wasn't actually points-based, it was like word-based, like excellent, good, average, poor, and the reviews themselves were also rated on this same sort of metric. So a review that was rated excellent by a lot of people would be, sort of very prominently placed at the top, and you'd know whether or not a mod would break your game or not, because the most prominent review would probably tell you.
Yeah, I think that's probably not going to be a system anymore. There's been one too many drama things that has happened for such a thing to be a possibility.
Oh yes, that was from the sort of early days of the internet. Morrowind Summit disappeared in like 2005, I think it was. Now, are there any particular mod resources you like to use in your mods?
I think the most obvious one, at least for Morrowind, is probably Pirate Lord and Darknut's Greater Dwemer Ruin resources. Especially Pirate Lords. I think since Deus Ex Machina, that has been my go-to resource for Dwemer mods and just little models and stuff. And it has been invaluable in constructing things. For Skyrim, I can't think of any one particular modder's resource I go to because I look at their resources or models on a case-by-case basis. If I need something here, I'll look it up. And I can't think of any particular modder's resource for Skyrim, at least, that I just use all the time. I think the closest might be St. Giab's textures, his Clockwork City textures, which I ported over from Morrowind and used to make the Sotha Sil architecture for Fear Manor and Wheels of Lull.
Oh yeah, I noticed that in your trailers anyway, that the models and textures, were very reminiscent of Morrowind.
That was intentional because they are not using Morrowind textures, but they're using retextures of a Morrowind texture. So I intentionally tried to make things look like they were from St. Giab's Clockwork City texture pack because that's the texture pack we recommend and endorse to be used alongside Sotha Sil Expanded, and pretty much all my mods kind of exist in that same modding canon as Sotha Sil Expanded. So the architecture is supposed to look the same, vaguely.
Oh, makes sense. And going on to another question, is there anything you've had to, give up to mod? Like playing more games or possibly your social life?
See, give up implies that somehow modding is a sacrifice rather than a hobby that I enjoy doing. I haven't given up anything to mod, no demon has appeared in my room and said, give me your teeth and the ability to spend time with your friends and you can make mods. When I mod, it's usually in my off time or free time, and I don't consider it lost time. I don't consider it as something I've given up to do something else. Maybe I'd like more time to do other stuff, but reflecting on it, I've enjoyed the time I've spent modding, and I don't think I would have given that up for anything else.
Oh yes, modding is a very enjoyable activity and definitely isn't a sacrifice in my opinion, but spending less time playing games that you might have otherwise done, or possibly spending less time socializing that you might have otherwise done. As I think what was meant by that question.
I personally feel that if you spend time doing something you enjoy, it's not time wasted at all. Gotta pick your battles.
Very true. And this next question sort of goes into a question we asked earlier, and it is, are there any skills you've learned from modding? And if so, have you been able to use those skills elsewhere?
Ooh, outside of game design, I think probably the biggest skill, or at least experience that I've had, is managing a team. And yet you have to get used to all those idiosyncrasies of getting people to do their job, or sometimes a team member drops out, and you have to try and find a replacement or deal with that. And so project management is probably, other than game design, is probably the biggest skill I've had to learn as a modder.
Now, sort of off topic, but are there any other games outside of the Elder Scrolls and Fallout games that you enjoy playing? And if so, what do you like about them?
My favorite genre is actually open world space sims. Like I said, my favorite game is Freelancer, so I've always been, if you had to choose fantasy over science fiction, I'd always choose science fiction. So my favorite games so far have always been, the other games that I enjoy playing have always been games where you have a ship and you trade stuff and you fight stuff to make money. So I've been a fan of the X series, Freelancer, Privateer, and of course, with the recent advent of things like Star Citizen and Elite Dangerous, I've gotten into that with a minor shout out to X Rebirth, but not much because it's not that great of a game.
Oh yes, it does seem like there's sort of been this renaissance of space sims, particularly on Kickstarter, with Star Citizen and Elite Dangerous, as you mentioned.
Yep. I feel like Citizen was pretty instrumental in that because after it kind of blew up in terms of marketing and just spreading everywhere. So I think once that was there, a lot of other people saw, hey, space sims still have an audience. You can still make money off them, which is where the other space sims started to come in.
Oh yeah, I almost think they were kind of on a decline before that. I mean, you didn't really see them popping up on the marketplace as much.
I don't think it was so much in a decline so much as it was dead. I can think of about maybe one or two space sims released between 2005 and 2010. There were very, very few. And it just kind of died off as a genre, and still, like you said, this renaissance of Star Citizen and similar came back.
Ah, good point. And, going back to other games that you might be playing, do you still play Dwarf Fortress? And this is a question from Dragon32.
Ha! Ooh, it's been a while since I've played Dwarf Fortress. I might have done it back in 2013, but unfortunately I haven't really found the time lately to get into a good game of Dwarf Fortress and watch as my dwarves horribly die to a giant eyeball.
I have noticed that quite a few modders seem to enjoy playing Dwarf Fortress.
What can we say? It has a certain potential to it.
Oh yes, and going on to another question. If you could mod one other game that perhaps doesn't support mods right now, what would it be?
Doesn't support mods. That's kind of a hard question for me to answer because most of the games I play do support mods. I can't think of any recent any recent games or games I've even played semi-recently that don't support mods. That one's got me stumped. I can't think of any game that I would want to have mods that I either can't mod already or wasn't satisfied with in terms of, playing the game.
Well, fair enough, fair enough. Going on to another question then. Is there any particular mod that you've been most happy with / proud of out of the ones you've released so far?
By far and away, the mod that I am most proud of is definitely Sotha Sil Expanded. That broke a lot of ground for me personally, just learning a lot of new techniques and pulling off a lot of crazy stuff. Wheels of Lull, I guess, might come close, but I still don't feel as much a sense of achievement with that as I did Sotha Sil Expanded. Partially because Wheels of Lull was a lot easier to make for me. I did some crazy stuff, but by then I was familiar with how it works. And partially because the cell of Wheels of Lull in comparison to Sotha Sil Expanded was a lot smaller.
Oh yes, the Wheels of Law. I remember it was sort of billed as the sequel to Sotha Sil Expanded, and it was also sort of your most recent sort of capstone Skyrim mod.
I do believe it might have actually been my most recent mod that wasn't just a fix-up and re-release too.
Oh yes, and I imagine that a fair amount of work went into it. I don't know how large it is myself because I haven't, played it. But is it on a similar scale to
It's
Sotha
about
Sil?
the size of... Ooh, no. Sotha Sil Expanded is very massive. Uh, Wheels of Lull is probably on the same size as Vanilla Tribunal. It's a pretty enclosed area with a few significant quests and a pretty extensive main quest, but it's not like the big, expansive monstrosity that was Sotha Sil Expanded.
Now, since you brought it up, I'm kind of curious now. Is there any particular, like, maybe limitation from modding Skyrim as opposed to Morrowind that, causes the Wheels of Lull to perhaps be a bit smaller than Sotha Sil Expanded?
Definitely. The biggest thing that gets in the way of me doing larger quest mods is actually writing the dialogue. In Skyrim, dialogue only has a 150 character limit, and you have to make voice files for each individual line. And that is so tedious and so ridiculously time consuming that it really turns me off of trying to make larger, more dialogue heavy mods. And every time I make a mod, my thought is less, oh, I can't wait to make this, and more, oh god, I have to do dialogue. I feel like that 150 character limit and a bunch of other stuff when it comes to handling dialogue was probably the weakest part of the construction of the creation kit, and it often makes me want to kill something. I hate it.
Oh yes, I can't even imagine. I mean, I'm a quest modder, and the thought of trying to voice act my, like, 10,000 word quest documents, no, I don't think that's ever going to happen.
Exactly.
Now, do you have a mod that hasn't received enough acclaim as you think it probably should have? And if so, which one and why?
Not one in particular, but I do feel like too much attention was given to the Thomas the Tank Engine Dragon mod for Skyrim than compared to my other mods. Because I have told people that took about an hour to make. The amount of attention and praise lavished on it and piled upon the Thomas the Tank Engine mod, and how little I spent on it, I often kind of question myself and say, okay, why don't you look at the other mods like Wheels of Lull or Sotha Sil Expanded that really kind of deserve this attention? I mean, I don't mind being the Thomas the Tank Engine guy. I quite like it, but at the same time, I feel like it's kind of stupidly hilarious how popular that mod got, given the amount of effort put into it, which was very little.
Not to rag on the gaming press some more, but, basically going back from what we were talking about with the gaming press not really understanding modders, uh, Thomas the Tank Engine got a lot of press with, gaming news, and it does seem like they don't spend quite as much of time focusing on the sort of more larger and impressive projects than they do the small one-laugh projects that just get a bunch of views and clicks, but maybe aren't that impressive in themselves.
True, and I think that's probably why they did it. It was kind of weird that after that Thomas the Tank Engine mod came out, you just started seeing a lot of mods and maps all over the internet involving Thomas the Tank Engine being some creepy murderer. And I still fear that Mattel might come after me and put a hit squad on me because I think I kind of started that trend.
Oh yes, I've seen some of those images, of Thomas the Tank Engine just barely visible in a blizzard, and you can tell that he's just plotting your demise.
It is quite creepy. I saw a very good one for Gary's mod, which was a game mode where you have to do platforming sections in a pretty narrow tunnel, while this demonic version of Thomas the Tank Engine is slowly coming towards, chasing after you. And I was like, that's quite fun. I want to do something like that.
I think in part, the creepiness of Thomas the Tank Engine just has a lot to do with childhood toys in general. I mean, really, like dolls, for example. You see a doll in an empty, dark room, and it is very terrifying.
I would say so, but I think Thomas the Tank Engine seems to reserve a special place in people's psyche because of that creepy, unmoving, smiling face, and also because it's a very large train.
Very true. A train is much more capable of killing you than, say, a cloth doll is. Now, this next question is another question from the Reddit user Hane2, and it is, if there was any mod that you had a chance to go back and redo, no time constraints, what would you redo? Alternatively, if you had unlimited time, budget, and talent, what kind of mod would you like to make?
Oh, when I release a mod, I'm pretty much satisfied with my work. Obviously, like I said with Deus Ex Machina, I kind of did a lot of patches to make it better and better. And I'm still not completely sure why I did that. I guess after 4 years, I had kind of gotten burned out on things, and my vision of what I wanted it to be had somewhat deteriorated. Now, if I had unlimited time, budget, and money, obviously the real thing I would make Nano Steam. But if it had to be a mod, I would say I would go out of my way and finish the Tatterdemalion mod, which was a canceled mod for Skyrim that took place on the moon. And a lot of people were looking forward to that, myself included. And if I had the resources, I would probably finish that myself, if I had the resources. Not to get people excited who were excited for that, sorry.
Now, I'm not really too familiar with that project. Did that have anything, related to perhaps Michael Kirkbride's Coda, which I believe also, sort of takes place on the moon a little bit?
Yes, it was actually Kirkbride was one of the team members, and that was supposed to be a weird lore mod, something that would introduce Skyrim players to the strange side of TES. And it had a lot of very nice concept artists and musicians and writers behind it, but unfortunately, most of them weren't actually modders, so the project kind of fell apart, even though there's a lot of design documents still out there on it. And like I said, it was a lot of people were kind of disappointed that it fell apart, but, what can you do?
Oh yes, that is very unfortunate. And going on to another user submitted question. This is yet another one from Illy. After you found the Bethesda forums, did you immediately join, or did you lurk on the forums for a while? Now, since you're kind of busy, with your Fallout mod and your Nanosteam game, I don't know if this next question really applies, but are there any mods or modders that currently have your attention in the community?
Well, there's definitely Enderall, which is the Nehrim sequel for Skyrim. That's very much something I'm looking forward to. But in terms of Morrowind, I think it goes without saying that I very much am looking forward to seeing what Autoclock produces with his Sotha Sil mod.
Oh yes, and perhaps Darknut with his version 2.0 of Darknut's Greater Doom of Runes?
I don't want to rag on Dark because, like I said, he's a huge inspiration, but I'm not particularly following that. I'll probably reserve my judgment for when I see more to get me excited, especially if there's trains.
Fair enough. And are there any mods you look at and think, I wish I made that?
Not particularly. When it comes to mods, there's never something that I look at and say, oh, I wish I made that. I always just kind of like to make what I like to make. And even if it already exists, like if someone's made a similar mod, I just make it anyway. Because for me, modding is less about trying to fulfill some sort of niche and more making something that I want to see made as I want to see it.
That makes sense. And, going on to another line of questions, what do you think of Open Morrowind, and do you plan to make any Open Morrowind only mods once it should release?
I totally love Open Morrowind. I love the idea of it. I love how much it's reinvigorated a lot of sections of the community. I very much looking forward to what it will bring and what it has already brought, and I follow development regularly. In terms of Open Morrowind only mods, I will probably make some stuff. They will probably be not necessarily train related, but definitely movement related, because I know that a lot of limitations in terms of Morrowind's movement will be removed following OpenMW's release, and I want to do a thing or two there. Not to give any spoilers, but something movement related, definitely.
Now, are there any features, systems, and/or mechanics that you're particularly looking forward to being de-hard-coded in Open Morrowind?
First, like I said, the movement systems, as already mentioned. But I also really want to look more into the combat mechanics, because I probably won't release anything too significant there, but I will definitely want to play around with things, see if I can't make it a bit funner. Which is not a word, but I invented that word now, so.
Oh yes, Morrowind's combat is probably the biggest complaint coming from new players who start playing the game, and really, I hope Open Morrowind can do something about that. I mean, Morrowind's combat isn't terrible by any measure, but it does turn off a lot of people to the game.
Right, and I think Open Morrowind will definitely make, or at least people modding Open Morrowind will take some steps to hopefully improve that.
Now, this next question is a question from the Flying Bastard on Reddit, and it is: what kind of mods would you particularly like to make or see made by the community that were really difficult or possibly even impossible with vanilla Morrowind, but possible in Open Morrowind?
Definitely a multiplayer mod, and I don't mean like an MMO mod, but I would just love to do co-op with one or two friends across a very wide landscape. Not a lot of games let you do that, so. And I know a few teams out there have been making some strides in looking at OpenMW for multiplayer. And a lot of people say TES should never be multiplayer, but I don't feel there's anything wrong with taking one or two of my close friends and hopping on a guar and going across, the I forgot which region I was going to talk about. I want multiplayer. I personally support it.
Oh yes, just grabbing a friend, ganging up on Fargoth, and then running away from a Cliff Racer army. It does sound like it would be a lot of fun.
Exactly.
Now, sort of going into our closing questions, what do you think about the other Elder Scrolls games, like Skyrim and Oblivion? I know, obviously, you probably like Skyrim because you've been making a fair number of mods for it.
Yeah, I once read, I don't know if it was by, I don't know who exactly it was by, but it was talking about a car that was made by a Japanese company. And it said it was the car that had straddled the line between when Japanese companies were trying to break away and become their own expert car makers, and also were still trying to emulate other games, sorry, other cars. And thus it was just this horrible, horrible mismatch, and it was like the worst car ever. And that's kind of how I feel about Oblivion. It's kind of the awkward teenage thing in the family. It feels a lot of things are transitioning away from the traditional RPG aspect of the older TES games, but not enough so, and things just end up feeling bad in a lot of aspects. That being said, Oblivion probably has the best quests of all the TES games, particularly the Dark Brotherhood and the Thieves Guild. And of course, everyone loves the Shivering Isles. Skyrim, like I said, feel that Skyrim and Morrowind do a lot of things well and a lot of things not well equally. But if I had to make a choice, I would always Morrowind. That being said, I really did like Skyrim. I put a lot of hours into it, put a lot of hours into Oblivion, a lot more hours into Naren, which was the total conversion for Oblivion. As far as the other TES games go, I've always liked Battlespire and Redguard, but I've never been too much of a fan of Arena and Daggerfall especially. I really don't like Daggerfall.
Oh yeah, it seems like a lot of people, they have a soft spot for Daggerfall in particular, because it did have, a lot more skills than Morrowind or any of the later Elder Scrolls games did, and it had more possibilities and sort of crazy mechanics that maybe didn't make a whole lot of sense.
My complaints with Daggerfall are less because of the amount of things in it, and the more that everything really kind of fell flat for me. I don't like random generation in a lot of games, and so much of Daggerfall felt either randomly generated or very undetailed, and it just occupies an uncanny valley for me that I don't like.
Now, sort of going back to Morrowind, what do you think makes the Morrowind modding community so vibrant after more than a decade?
I have to attribute, like, the fact that mods exist in the first place is always something that increases the longevity of a game. But it's also probably the fact they are willing to share resources and that have been a lot of long-running projects. I think OpenMW, not too sure on this, but I think that it opened a lot of kind of reinvigorated a lot of open Morrowind modders and let them out. That is to say that it breathed a bit more life back into the modding community. And with the advent of games like Skyrim, and especially projects like Wind and MGSO, the Morrowind graphics and sound overhaul, and media giving more attention to an old game, that I think that it's also helped very much increase the longevity and attention on the game. And of course, the modders, especially with people still making mods. I can't say for sure what makes that so vibrant, but I'll just leave that an open question.
Oh yes, the community is still very, very active. I mean, I know 300 mods doesn't sound a lot in comparison to Skyrim, but the fact that a 12-year-old game managed to release 300 mods in 2014 is, something that's pretty impressive, I think.
Oh yeah, definitely. It'd be interesting to see when OpenMW comes out if that number will increase or decrease.
Oh yes, definitely. And do you think there's anything the Morrowind modding community should be doing in order to continue to expand and grow in the coming years?
Finish OpenMW, because once it goes open source, I've seen it in more than one game that open source games tend to attract a lot of more people. And if we want to expand and grow, supporting that project is definitely the way to go.
Oh yes, it is sort of unfortunate that the release date for Open Morrowind has kind of been pushed back. Originally, Zinni was promising it would be done by the end of 2015, but our interview with Scroll revealed that it's probably going to be 2016 at this rate.
True, but at the same time, if we look at what's going on with OpenMW, they're pretty much feature complete. The thing that remains is optimization and bug fixes, which can be an involved process. I think that it is kind of in an unofficial way done, but at the same time, obviously, there's a lot of things to work out.
Oh yes, and they just changed like a major component their engine to, and I'm sure that didn't help things either.
Oh, definitely.
Now, is there any advice you'd like to give to a budding new Morrowind modder, or possibly even Skyrim modder, out there looking to release their first mod?
Don't do what I did. Start small, and most importantly, always, always, always back up your work. But finally, I think don't be afraid to try new things. Don't be afraid to be weird or overly detailed or combine things in ways that shouldn't be combined. Because that's what makes your mod stand out. That's what makes your mod unique, and that's what makes you unique.
Oh yes, the backing up advice is especially important. We've lost so many major projects because of lack of backups. Now, finally, is there anyone in the community you'd like to give a shout out to?
I think we've already talked about plenty of people in the community, so I don't think I'd like to give one particular shout out now.
Alright, that's pretty much all the questions I have for you then, and so thank you for agreeing to do this interview.
It was my pleasure.